Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to an all-new Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. In today's episode we shall be reviewing the Lockheed P-38J-15 Lightning, an American heavy fighter coming to tier of 4 and a battle rating of 4.0. To provide you with a historical overview as to how we get from the P-38G variant, which is also in game and we've reviewed previously, review available using the link in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now, all the way through to the P-38J variant, and in particular the -15 sub-variant, we begin thus. With the P-38G entering service in June of 1942, efforts were continuously made by Lockheed over the course of the variant's production life to improve the heavy fighter design. In particular, the 10th production block, the P-38G-10, saw the introduction of a stronger wing midsection, enabling the plane to carry under each wing either a 300-gallon fuel tank for ferrying duties or a single 1,000-pound bomb, taking the plane's potential bomb load up to 3,200 pounds, or 1,451 kilograms. This stronger midsection became commonplace on the P-38H variant, which arrived by the summer of 1943. The H also saw the introduction of the 1,425 horsepower Allison V1710 8991 engine, which had to be restricted to a total power output of 1,240 horsepower. This was due to the plane's intercoolers being situated on the leading edge of the wings, between the engine nacelles, or the engine housing we could call it, and the cockpit, preventing sufficient cooling being provided to the engines when they were run at full power, and therefore engine overheating was commonplace. However, it was the introduction of the P-38J variant in August of 1943 that would see the Lightning design go through a major overhaul. Firstly, to overcome the engine overheating issue in the P-38H, chin intercoolers were added to the base of the engine nacelles, enabling the engines to operate at their full power now that they were receiving sufficient engine cooling, and this eliminated the need for the intercoolers based on the leading wing edge. In turn, this increased the plane's top speed to a total of 414 miles per hour or 666 kilometers an hour in level flight. Secondly, to help reduce the compressibility, i.e. the loss of control at higher speed, experienced by the plane, a set of electrically operated dive flaps were introduced to the undersides of the outer wing panels, making it easier for the pilot to pull out of a high-speed dive. Thirdly, to help reduce the effort needed from the pilot to manoeuvre the plane, the P-38J was to be the first fighter aircraft to see the introduction of power-boosted controls. These were in the form of hydraulically powered aileron boosters, which improved the plane's roll rate in general, and meant that the pilot only needed to exert 17% of the typical force required to roll the plane. And finally, to improve the pilot's survivability in head-on engagements, the plane's windscreen was redesigned, from a round windscreen to a flat, three-piece windscreen made out of armoured glass. A total of 2,970 P-38Js were produced, seeing service both in the Pacific and Europe, becoming the standard P-38 variant on the battlefield as of early 1944. It should be noted, however, that the P-38J-15, which you're seeing on screen today, was produced midway through the P-38J's production lifespan, with the -15 denoting production block 15. As a result, the -15 did not see the introduction of the power-boosted ailerons, as these were only introduced in the P-38J-25-LO, LO standing for Lockheed produced, production block, which formed the final 210 P-38J aircraft, before the arrival of the P-38L in June of 1944. And with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at the P-38J-15 handles in the skies of War Thunder Arcade. Today's gameplay is brought to you from the ground strike map African Canyon. For this will be used in the following setup. Stealth belts for both types of armament, the reasoning being that in general the stealth belts prove to be the most powerful belt for armament on this aircraft, or at least in my experience. One could argue, however, that the universal belt is more effective for the 12.7mm machine guns, with the higher concentration of armour-piercing incendiary rounds in a 3:2 ratio compared to on the stealth belts. However, we also have to consider that the stealth belts lack tracer components to their rounds, which enable you to surprise foes when you engage them from their 6 in a boom and zoom pass. Whereby as you open fire and happen to miss the target, they may be none the wiser to your presence due to lack of tracer whizzing past their cockpit. Our gun convergence is set to the formal 500 meters, with all the armament being based on the nose and therefore not convergence reliant, and our fuel load is set to the standard 30-minute fuel load to ensure we can make it to the end of the game, unscathed on fuel capacity. Now immediately you're seeing one of the key strengths of the P-38J-15, and that is its rather good climb rate, which is able to equal or better anything at its battle rating tier. Combine to that the attacker spawn you get at the start of the match, and you'll be one of the first, if not the first plane, to penetrate the 5,000 metre altitude buffer. And you can go even further beyond that, going up to 6,000 metres if you judge your climb correctly, as we're seeing here. This even applies in Battle Rating 5.0 games, whereby you'll be matched for climb if not slightly outrunning the climb by the likes of the Messerschmitt 19G2, the F8F-1 Bearcat. That's just two examples. But in general, with the ability to get above most of the opposition to start with, you're able to establish an altitude ceiling on your foes as long as they do not start separating all the way to the edges of the map, one climbing from say the east and one from the west. Unfortunately here we have two Spitfire F Mark 9s who are deciding to try and use energy tactics by yo-yos and turn underneath us in order to try and bait us down to boom and zoom one of them whilst the other comes up on our 6. But one of the key things to success in the P-38J-15, which you'll hopefully see throughout the course of this gameplay, is that you need to be patient in picking off your targets, and if anything you need to avoid rushing into engagements more so than any other aircraft, because the P-38J is a very powerful plane if played in a calm manner. When you don't think things are right, just break back up to altitude, because what you'll see is that over time your opponents will start to make mistakes or put themselves in positions whereby you only need a single burst of your firepower to rip them out the sky. This Spitfire here being a prime example. As they go into their split S, we take them out for our first kill and we're able to zoom climb back up to the west before the other Spitfire can get onto our 6. And by the time they start to close in, we're already in our return climb from our zoom, and what we can see here is that the energy retention in the vertical for the P-38J-15 is phenomenal. It's one of the best at its battle rating tier, being able to conserve all of its energy when coming out of a boom and zoom pass, so long as you do not let your speed go above 800 km an hour in the dive. If you do, what you will find above 800 km an hour is that your decent dive speed acceleration begins to wear off massively, and in turn what this means is you are converting more potential energy into kinetic energy rather than the previous ratio when you were below 800 km an hour and you are starting to lose your potential energy, and therefore you'll not be able to regain as much altitude in your return climb. Therefore avoid heading towards your maximum dive speed of 927 km an hour in the short distance boom and zoom passes, and you'll retain your altitude very well through boom and zoom. Of course, as we'll see later on, when you go for those long distance boom and zoom passes through the battlefield, that's where you want to push towards your 927 km an hour top dive speed. Now what this means is over the course of the game you can essentially frustrate your foes in being that one heavy fighter that's always up high, and if anything you are playing to your strengths, because your ideal altitude range is between 4,000 and 8,000 metres, at which point your engines will be performing at their maximum and your control surfaces will be at their best. We dive down here on one Spitfire, can't get the shots, they go into a split S, so we decide just to switch to another target, another Spitfire ahead of us, a Mark 5B. Now the Mark 5B is quite aware of our oncoming presence and comes around to go head to head, but then realises that our nose mounted firepower will give us the advantage in the head to head, so they snap right out of the way. Now one of the issues with the P-38J-15 is that you have poor controllability with increasing speed, particularly as you start to go above 650 km an hour. Your decent roll rate begins to lock up severely, whereby between 650 and 800 km an hour you will lose 75% of your roll rate. Your elevator, which is rather strong in general, only begins to lock up at 800 km an hour, all the way up to 900 km an hour, losing 50% of its capability, following on from the historical overview, whereby the elevator on this plane is going to be strong due to the addition of the flaps underneath the wings, and what this means is you're able to pull up out of a dive rather nicely. And your rudder, which is your poorest control surface by a huge margin, that locks up between 700 and 800 km an hour, losing 50% of its control capability. And I would strongly recommend never doing a flat turn in this plane on the rudder, or even a hammerhead to a major extent, because the rudder is so poor that it takes a very long time to execute either of those manoeuvres. So instead, play particularly around your ailerons and your elevator, and use the rudder to provide very small adjustments in passes or attacks on targets. We start to make our way towards this enemy Hampton who's trying to climb out of spawn, and we're going to rip them apart in the head on before they're able to return fire with their limited firepower, and we can see the principle of bomber interception coming into play here. Perhaps not the best example of a bomber at our battle rating tier, with the Hampton being a much lower battle rating aircraft, but you can take the example from that we can very quickly traverse the battlefield and intercept an enemy bomber that's trying to climb or level bomb. We go for a reload at this point, and it's worth commenting that you have sufficient ammunition to last you for a long period of time, worth 2,000 machine gun rounds and, as we're going to see, 150 cannon rounds, meaning that reloads are going to be infrequent if you manage your output nicely. But then again, this comes onto a problem, which is your ability to do damage. Now what I've said previously over the course of this review already is that the armament you have is very powerful, and we have seen examples of that, but it's very precise. As in, if you miss your target even by a small margin, there's very little dispersion on your firepower, which means that if you happen to miss by the smallest of margins, you will graze a foe rather than do any significant damage. And that is one of the other frustration points of this plane, is the fact that unless you are right on target, it's going to feel as though you're missing every shot. Which is why this starts to echo this concept of keeping a cool head and playing it safe, playing it smart, avoiding situations where you have to rush. Instead, pick on your foes when they're in their weakest energy state, or cause them to be in the weakest possible energy state, get them on predictable flight paths, and you'll have a much more successful time. As we now split test over the top of this J2M2, and rinse and repeat the words we just said. Picking off very nicely, ripping off their right hand wing for another kill. And then using our energy retention in the vertical once more, going into our zoom climb to get back right up to where we dove down from. Now what happens above 8,000 meters altitude, you may be wondering, in the case that you have to chase down a bomber that's crept all the way up there? Well, 8,500 meters in particular, your control surfaces begin to become heavy, and on top of that your engine output begins to decline, and by the time you hit 9,000 meters altitude, you'll really notice it. But what this means is that you have a performance advantage over a large chunk of your competitors in that very high altitude space. Not that you'll typically see engagements up there, but when somebody needs to go take down that one bomber that's crept up there, you're the one to do it because you've got the performance to do so. Conversely, when you go below 3,500 meters, the story becomes very similar. Your control surfaces do not feel as responsive, and your engine output in particular begins to weaken. And you'll notice this in particular with regards to straight line acceleration. In your ideal altitude range of 4,000 to 8,000 meters, you'll find that your straight line acceleration from your stall speed of 135 km an hour to 500 km an hour is great, and with war emergency power you can kick that all the way up to 600 km an hour before you start to see the decline. Below 3,500 meters altitude, however, you drop all those thresholds by 100 km an hour, meaning that your ability to build up speed is weakened, and therefore you can't maintain the speed that gives you the ability to be untouched by your opponents. As we're seeing throughout this game, we're maintaining speed, but go low enough and you'll find it very hard. And this of course exacerbates your ability to turn fire or dodge incoming fire when people are on your 6, because you start to lose your ability to maintain speed, to build up speed, and therefore your turning circle, which is already rather poor even in your ideal speed range, only starts to get worse. Whereby if you move this plane outside the ideal speed range of 400 to 600 km an hour, you're going to have a nightmare, particularly below 400 km an hour, heading towards 300 km an hour or less. The turn circle becomes very wide, very slack, and on top of that in particular your elevator starts to become rather heavy, although you maintain your roll rate even at the lowest of speeds. Now what else is there to talk about as we just play things casually and note the P-39N0 Aerocobra climb up out to spawn towards us? Well, the other key items to note are in terms of this plane's ability to essentially provide an escort for friendly bombers. If we had a number of bombers on our team who wanted to level bomb up high, we would be the one to escort them, and you will see that a little bit later on, with one particular foe who is taken completely by surprise. But for now we're just going to swing over the top of this Aerocobra, noting how we use the rudder very slightly here to drop on them a little bit faster. We're using the rudder just to fine tune movements, bring about small hammerhead manoeuvres or just small cuts into split S's. And that's where you can see how the rudder, despite its poor performance as we mentioned earlier, does have its advantages to some extent. Now of course at this point we should come on to the concept of durability. It's always a wonderful one to talk about in all planes, and what is interesting to note is that in a head-on pass, the armoured glass that your cockpit now has, thanks to the change of the canopy, what of the introduction of the P-38J compared to the H, as talked about in the historical overview, that is reflected in game. One of the key issues upon reflection in my experience of the P-38J was that pilot sniping on the plane was rather common. In this plane it's a lot less frequent because of the introduction of the armoured glass and the three-piece canopy. Therefore you're able to go into head-ons and not typically lose your pilot anymore. But what can happen is that you'll get one stray bullet hit one of your engines. And this will cause the engine to do one of two things. Either break, which isn't as bad if you're able to get away because you can fly this plane on a single engine, unlike the TA-154A1 Heavy fighter that we reviewed 2 weeks ago from what I recall, link available in the top right corner of your screen as displayed now. So you can fly away on a single engine, which is a nice thing to have, or alternatively the engine is going to burst into flames and you're just going to burn to death very quickly. And that extends to hits on the inner section of your wings, whereby if you're hit there, one of two things is going to happen. A fire will break out and you're going to burn to a crispy death, or alternatively, the most inconvenient thing of all when flying this plane, you will lose controllability of one side of the aircraft. Now what do I mean by this as we demonstrate the speed and the interception capabilities of the P-38J-15 and going after this Yak 9 who has no idea we're coming as they're trying to go for our friendly Heinkel 111. As we can see, we're getting nice and close and they only react at the last minute before we rip apart this Yak 90 for another kill. They break up and we score a nice set of hits to pick up what appears to be the ace. What I mean by the damage dealt to the inner section of the wing is the fact that when you take a hit on the inner section, so between the engine, the sail and the cockpit, your ability to lift up your nose, i.e. use your elevator, is compromised by a very heavy leaning towards the damaged side of the plane. Which means when you try to just pull up to do a loop, what you end up doing in some respects is starting to try and force yourself into a roll. Now it's not because you've activated your ailerons down that side of the plane, no, it's just the fact that the plane's leaning so much on that side, which means you then have to counteract that leaning effect by trying to roll the plane the other way temporarily. And in return, this costs you a lot of speed and bleeds out your energy, and means that when you're trying to turn around on someone who's stalling out underneath you, if they're stalling out in the wrong direction, either it be counterclockwise from the damaged section of the wing or clockwise, depending on where you've been hit, handling the plane becomes hell. And what it means is those situations where you think you're going to get a clear shot on the foe become a lot harder to manage, and in turn your killing potential drops off noticeably unless you can really manage for it and cause your opponents to be in perfect positions for you to shoot at for a longer period of time. Now at this point we go into our long dive, and what we can note here is as we drop our altitude, we start to lose the one thing that we've taken so preciously throughout the course of this game, and that is altitude dominance over the opposition. We dive down here on the enemy Typhoon, they're unsuspecting of our presence and we rip them apart. The Typhoon Mark 1B late, gone out of the game, picking up our 6th kill, and then we break away. But note how we dropped all the way down to 1,000 meters altitude before going into our return climb. And because we went over 800 kilometers an hour and we started to sacrifice more potential energy than we'd typically afford, it means that now we've actually constricted ourselves to a world of we can't get back to the starting altitude we were at, and instead we have to now loop over and try to level ourselves out and engage someone at a little bit lower altitude. And in the meantime, while the Spitfires that spawned in is going to start pursuing us and gaining altitude over us. We look towards the Hurricane Mark II, and here we can see against their light armament of the 12 7.7mm machine guns, the armoured glass comes in handy, while the centre cockpit and the central section of the plane taking a number of hits, but our pilot hasn't been injured at all, let alone knocked out. So things are coming in handy in terms of the additional protection. I guess another thing to question is what happens to your control surfaces when they're hit. Well, they will just fall off the plane. I.e. you're not going to be able to conserve your control surfaces if they're just slightly grazed, you will feel the effects noticeably. And here we can see the Spitfire now pursuing us, but the game's coming to its end, with the last ground target of the enemy team about to be eliminated. And therefore we can just fly away to live to fight another day, using our speed to keep the Spitfire at arm's length. Again, this is another way of frustrating those who would like to pursue you for the majority of the match. Game over, let's go take a look at the post-game stats. With our 7 kills, we're able to pick up 26,999 Silver Lions and 3,296 research points. To defeat the P-38J-15 in a given matchup then, I can recommend one or two approaches. Option 1 is the clear-cut one of forcing this plane to turn fight with you, as the vast majority of fighters and heavy fighters at this plane's battle rate and tier will be able to outturn it quite easily. The simple trick is force this plane to engage you at an altitude below 3,500 meters and below a starting speed of 400 kilometers an hour. As said, the P-38J pilot will be playing against the strengths of their plane and playing into its performance weaknesses. And it will only take 1 or 2 turns before this plane is going to be a sitting duck in terms of your gun sight. Alternatively, it will start to stall out despite its low stall speed of 135 kilometers an hour. And if you can force the line and pilot into a stall, they'll need to get their speed back up to 260 kilometers an hour before they've fully recovered from the stall, giving you ample time to get a clear shot. If you cannot force the P-38J-15 pilot into a turn fight from the outset, then your trick will be to get above it and behind it, sitting at a distance of approximately 2 kilometers behind it and roughly 1,000 meters altitude above it, whereby then the P-38J-15 pilot will only have 1 or 2 options available to them. Either run and run for the rest of the game, or alternatively turn and go for the head-on. But by the time they've gone for the head-on with you, having turned 180 degrees, they will have lost a lot of their kinetic energy and therefore be right for the taking in terms of you being able to force them into the turn fight or get a lot closer to shoot them down in pursuit. Therefore, by avoiding such circumstances today in our own P-38J-15 and emphasising the need to establish altitude supremacy from the outset thanks to our wonderful climb rate and the attacker spawn, what we have seen is a very slow-paced nature for the P-38J-15 compared to a lot of the single-engined fighters in particular this plane goes up against at a battle rate of 4.0, whereas those fighters enjoy a much rougher and tougher match, and one that's much more excitable, whereby you'll go into dogfights, you'll turn fight with foes, you'll attack multiple foes in the boom and zoom pass, cut across the battlefield. The P-38J-15 requires patience and refinement in your technique, making sure to only attack those when you feel really confident and you feel certain you can go for the kill, and never overextending from your high altitude perch, whereby if your friendly bombers come up high, you can always escort them to target and keep them supported throughout the rest of the match. Alternatively, you can always dive down every so often for quick, clean pickings and then go back up to altitude and rinse and repeat. Therefore, compared to what you may be used to, the P-38J-15's playstyle is one of low intensity. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.